Many of the settings that you deal with in embroidery lettering are common to a lot of typography, but connection type, that's really one that's just an embroidery setting. Here I have just MELCO spelled out in block alphabet, and it's an older alphabet, but it illustrates the connections fairly well just in how it's layered. And I have it in an obnoxious bright green just so we can see how that light plays across those stitches a little bit better. So let's right click and go to properties so we can see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this connection type. So for this, we have three options. We have as digitized, bottom connect, and closest point. The first one is as digitized. And what this does is it sews out the lettering as the digitizer intended. The digitizer that created the alphabet digitized these letters in a specific order, so it'll sew one part of the M, and then the next part, and then the next part, and then the next part. And then we digitizers who are using these alphabets can then alter that order. So if we're sewing from left to right and we have this as digitized, it's going to sew out as the digitizer intended. Everything's going to layer just like they mean it to. And if we slow redraw this, you can see how it's kind of playing out and how it's sewing. The next connection type I want to look at is closest point. Closest point connections are used with small lettering that is so small that you often don't want to trim between the letters, and you don't really want to have those tie stitches because the letters are so small that the tie stitches may create a little bubble or bump in your lettering. And using connectors between the letters and not trimming them out will give you kind of a better sew quality because the letters are so small that that tie stitch bump that may happen or dimple that may occur is going to be noticeable in those small stitches, and then the connector is so small that it's not going to be nearly as noticeable between the letters. So let's create some lettering that is that small. I'm going to take this down to 0.35 inches, and now you'll see that I am connecting between all of my letters. So I've got a connection here, here, and by changing it to closest point, it is connecting wherever the letters are the closest. So with the M and the E, I mean, it's all the same distance right in here. It really could have connected along the bottom, the middle, or the top. With the E, it's going to be either the top or the bottom. With the L, well, there's only one place that's close. And with the C, it could have been either here or here. Now, as it did this, notice how it resequenced this letter. So the top of the E, when we did this as digitized, had this nice kind of mitered edge. You don't see the overlap of stitches. Looks really clean. When I go to closest point connection, it's resequencing, it's sewing the top after it sews this, so those stitches are going to overlap a little bit differently. Now, typically when you're using closest point connection, you are dealing with stuff that is so small that you're not going to notice how those overlap. Generally, when I'm making a decision like this, it is going to be, am I sewing my lettering large enough that I need to trim out between my stitches? And if I am sewing that large, I would probably notice that it is resequencing those elements. So if I'm sewing larger lettering, and at this point I'm thinking maybe around a half an inch tall is where I start to make these decisions. If I'm sewing larger letters that I'll notice that kind of resequencing, I'm probably going to want to trim between them anyway, so I will sew as digitized. If I'm sewing smaller letters where I'm not going to want to trim and I want to have those connectors, I'm probably sewing small enough that I'm not going to see the changing of the element in the sequence, so that I probably won't see how it's overlapping a little bit differently. The last connection type that I want to look at is bottom connect, and this just moves all the connections along the bottom, which is fine for some things. It's really handy if you're planning on trimming things out by hand, although if you are planning on trimming them out by hand, make sure your tie-ins and tie-offs for the lettering element are set to always, because right now, if I were to do that, I would trim this by hand and there would be nothing holding this L in place. I don't have a tie stitch here because it's not trimming. If I change it to always, you can see that it is tying, and then I could trim this out by hand if I wanted to. That's about the only time I use always. Most of the time I use only when necessary, and honestly, most of the time I have the machine trim when I want it to. So those are your connection types. Typically I go between closest point and as digitized, and most of the time I'm leaving things as digitized, which keeps them as the digitizer intended. I may choose to go closest point when I'm dealing with very small lettering and I want to keep those connectors. They'll hide well in my stitching when they're very, very small, and I won't notice the resequencing of my letters. And then bottom connect is something I do very, very rarely if I want to trim something out by hand. And if I'm trimming anything out by hand, I need to make sure that I adjust my tie settings so that I have tie stitches before I start trimming those threads.